Hello, can you hear me all right? Yes, at the back? I can't see you because I've taken my glasses off. So, best of luck. Yes, I might say that although I am a member of the Queensland Museum, they don't pay me. And so my current address is my home, my lovely table where I work. We call it the Southern Hemisphere Lab Microvertebrate Paleontology. Okay, a little bit, first I must thank the organizers for bringing us here to Les Aisies. I last came in 2011 for one day when I was able to visit the Font de Gaume and the Prehistoric Museum. So it is wonderful to be back and to learn more, especially about the wonderful work that is being done here. Today, I would like to talk to you a little bit about French women in vertebrate paleontology. Somehow I've got a little extra there. I have no idea where that's come from. Forgive me, but in the end of July, I had a small problem with my eye and a little vein burst. And for 2 months now, I've not been able to look at computers or type. And so this is really, I had to make my talk this morning, first time I've looked at a computer. So if there are funny things, it's because I have a funny eye. I am a vertebrate paleontologist, and I just want to acknowledge, as I usually do, the dinosaur book of dear Ned Colbert, which in the 50s I found in my local library in the middle of England, Wolverhampton, where I grew up. And that brought me to these wonderful words, Tyrannosaurus rex, vertebrate paleontology. I learned to spell them, and over the next decade or so, I wondered if I would ever be able to study dinosaurs and the like. Well, I was lucky. I went to Reading University. I found the right person. You'll know Beverly Halstead of Reading was my teacher, and I was able to become a vertebrate paleontologist. So I very much appreciate all the vertebrate paleontologists in the past and like to learn about them. And particularly like me, why on earth, especially women, do they get into this rather strange study of dead bones? Very peculiar thing to do. Well, I then went to working in museums all my life. And working in museums, you meet all sorts of collections and you meet all sorts of collectors. And so it became a fascinating question to ask. When I met a fossil collector, why are you doing this? And from there, I went on to history. Some of you will know that I have studied some of the women in geology. And since I went to live in Australia in 1980, I have studied particularly Australian women. Well, in 2017, a colleague from America, Annalisa Berta of San Diego, contacted me by email and said, I'm going to write a book about women in vertebrate paleontology. I want to look at all the history and find out what women have done. And she said, where do I find my sources? I thought, oh, that's a strange request. And Annalisa Berta, professor in San Diego, based at the museum and the university, studies particularly these days fossil whales, but she had not done any history. So within a few weeks, she invited me to join her. And for the next 3 years, we were both immersed in trying to find women in the past and over the past 200 years, right through to modern women who are working today. And we wrote a book, and rather quickly, I suppose, 3 years, and we published it in October 2020, Johns Hopkins University Press. So I'm promoting it if you like. I would like if you would go out and buy it, but don't feel you have to. The problem was it was supposed to be launched in October 2020. And as we all know, this little virus came along and most meetings were cancelled, and we were not allowed actually to launch our book, although there was a virtual meeting we had problems and the book never got launched. So the book is called Rebels, Scholars and Explorers, Women in Vertebrate Paleontology, and we have over 1,200 women recognized in that book. Collectors, researchers, artists, paleoartists, preparators, curators. We have tried to cover all fields of women and their work in the field of vertebrate paleontology. But today, I would like to quickly introduce you to some of the French women that have done this wonderful work and contributed to the discovery and interpretation of fossil vertebrates, not only in France, but in other parts of the world. Particularly, I suppose the French women have worked in French colonies, in French-speaking countries. And so it's quite interesting to compare, say, the English world, the British Empire, and so on, Australia, with the other parts of the world where other colonists have been operating. Wolf has just told you how the French came to Australia, but sadly, I don't think even a strange woman crept onto the boats. We don't seem to have any French women finding fossils in Australia. Just to remind you that I have many sources and very important ones. I must acknowledge our dear colleague, Philippe Taquet, for his book, his biography, autobiographical account, because in that book, it introduces you to many of the more recent women in the late 20th century that Philippe has worked with. I won't be able to talk about all the living women, but we'll hopefully get through a few. For the book, we looked at many sources. We looked at contemporary accounts, historical accounts, biographies back through the 200 years of history. My own colleague, Ron Cleveley, who wrote a very important list of paleontologists. In that, I found one reference to a French woman, Madame or Mademoiselle Généret, who collected fossils in France and gave them to a museum in England. But I know nothing about it. So there are so many hidden histories, especially when you start to study women in geosciences or science in general. Another place I've been was to Paris, of course, to the museum, and I sat in the Gaudry Library and went through many interesting books and theses, and I found some of my women there. The other important source from 1940, when the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology was founded, is the news bulletins that are produced by the Society. Sadly, no longer, it's all online now, but the news bulletins, if you can get hold of a full set, are really worth reading because they give you very fascinating accounts of expeditions and people and all sorts of intimate details even about people's lives. And another good source, of course, has been the internet. Colleagues of Mireille Gaillet and Claude, Babin, produced a wonderful list of French paleontologists, which was published and has also become online. That is quite useful, but there are not so many vertebrate paleontologists in that list. So what I hope is that eventually this work will add to that and all this material will go online in due course. So yes, the book, Philippe's book, thank you. And my book is found on Johns Hopkins University Press online. Just as a brief look, we remind ourselves that one of the founders, if you like, one of the earliest women in vertebrate paleontology is Mary Anning, who of course began to collect as a child. And this link to France, again, I acknowledge Philippe, his work on Cuvier and Martin Rudwick's work and others that have written extensively about Mary Anning. But some of Mary's fossils were brought to Paris, to the museum. Cuvier, although he was rather distrustful at the beginning of some of the finds, eventually he actually gave support to Mary and bought several of the fossils that went to Paris. Cuvier also supported another English woman, Mary Buckland, who was, before she was married, she was an illustrator for Cuvier in his wonderful ossements fossile volume. So that was quite fascinating. But where were the French women at this time? Were there not French women illustrators knocking around in Paris in the museum? Maybe Philippe and I can talk about that later. Mary Anning's dog, one of my favorites, drawn by herself. So the 19th century is a bit of a blank field, I'm afraid, with French women. And one of my few that I managed to get into our book, Madame, name unknown, de Christol. Don't know anything about her dates. She was working at some point, maybe in the early 1800s, but we do know that she was a pioneer archaeologist, archaeozoologist, who found evidence of association of fossils and tools, animals in caves in southern France, but I'm not even sure where in southern France. I hypothesized that she might have been married to Jules de Christol, who was also working in the Languedoc area, but certainly from my own researches, I haven't been able to pin down any more about her. Yell out if anybody knows her. I found one reference to her in Henry Fairfield Osborne, one of his papers. She clearly found something like mammoths and bear. And I found a reference to her in a Smithsonian report on vertebrate paleontology, but that's all I found. Another woman, and I'm hoping that the bust of Cuvier that Philippe showed in his talk was actually sculpted by a woman. Hooray! Mademoiselle or Madame, I don't know, Julie Charpentier. So fine, I don't know very much more about her. I'd like to know more. She was a friend of Agassiz, I know that. Of course, Cuvier mentored Louis Agassiz when young, and he became really the founder, the source for us people who work on fossil fish with his wonderful researches using Cuvier's fossils at the beginning. So there may well have been other women in the early days in the museum and in other parts of France, but as yet, I haven't found them. And so the first that we managed to put in our book is this woman, Madeleine Friant, who began on a sort of anatomical lesson, if you like. She trained in various things, part of the anatomical and ambulance division. I don't know a lot about that, but she went on to actually study fossil mammals, and she wrote many, many papers. She was obviously a very good comparative anatomist, and eventually in 1927, she obtained her full doctorate, and she also moved to the museum in Paris, and I think even rose to be a director of one of the labs of zoology, comparative zoology. So a very important woman. And fortunately, when I was in the Gaudry Library, I discovered the dictionary of the museum personnel by Monsieur Geosciences and Raigou, and Madeleine has a brief biography in that. But they knew no dates for her. She was virtually unknown, if you like. With the help of a French colleague, Aude Vincent, we actually found a birth date for her using the equivalent of French ancestry. And I hope to do a little bit more. But we don't know anything about her later life. I don't know if this picture I found is her or not. And we don't know when she dies. So more mysteries. But what I do know is that she went to England at some point for research, I presume, at the Natural History Museum in London. She may have worked or known Arthur Smith Woodward at the museum, but more likely she visited him after he retired in 1924. And she visited their home and signed the famous tablecloth that Lady Maud Smith Woodward She embroidered all the names of the scientists who came to visit them and had dinner or tea or whatever. So there she is. Oh, I haven't got a pointer, but she's up there on the top left, Mme Friant. So splendid. I think there may only be one other woman, I think Tilly Edinger perhaps, but she's one of the rare women to sign this wonderful tablecloth that Angela Milner, the late Angela Milner, wrote about when we had the centenary volume with the Geological Society of London for Arthur Smith Woodward. So more mysteries, lots to find out. There are prehistorians, of course, as we're here in this wonderful place. Henriette Alimen is probably one of the best known women in the earlier period in the 20th century, and she gained high French honours. Sadly, I can find only one possible picture of her. She's somewhere in that knot of men, right at the back, with the camera in front of her face. So, anybody got the picture of Marie Henri? I would like to have one, please. Another woman who worked as a geologist and to some degree prehistorian, especially the Quaternary, I'm very interested in her. She is Nicole Petitmer, and some of you may have known her. I've done quite a lot of work on UNESCO projects, IGCP projects, and we're currently looking at women who have gained the heady heights of the executive for the International Union of Geological Sciences. And Nicole Petitmer was the second woman only to get up into the executive. She ran very important IGCP projects looking particularly at climate change in Africa and the relationship between humans and climate during Quaternary to Holocene. So very interesting now when we're all thinking about and being affected by climate change. And we will be writing more about her for the IUGS, and we plan a paper in episodes, the IUGS journal. The next woman I really found who has made major contributions to vertebrate paleontology was Colette Deschasseaux. And I found her thesis in the Gaudry Library in Paris. And I was a little bit put out because really for the first 1 or 2 decades of her life, she worked on mollusks, on bivalves, and had nothing to do with vertebrate paleontology. But for whatever reason, and I think it could have been the influence of Piveteau, she changed to paleoneurology and looked a lot at fossil brains, and particularly of mammals, and especially bats. She was very fascinated by bats, and later on other mammals as well. And she, if you like, was perhaps a successor to Tilly Edinger. Many of you may know the Jewish paleontologist who had to escape from the Nazis, went first to Britain and then to America to the Museum of Comparative Zoology. And she really founded the field of paleoneurology. And Colette was really her successor in France. And they became good scientific friends and corresponded. So I hope to get into more detail in that correspondence. There was a very fine biography of Tilly Edinger about 2 decades ago by German colleagues, and many of the letters are there, and there are ones from Colette. So I hope to find out more. Meanwhile, again, in the museum in Paris, Jeanne Signot joined at some point in her young life, I think not as a scientist in the first instance, maybe as an assistant only, and she worked with the then director Camille Arenbourg and wrote many of the reports, or if he wrote a report to the SVP in the post-war period, he would mention her. I'm not sure if she actually joined the society, but many of the work that was later in the 50s was with Jeanne Signot. So another important lady who was, if you like, a role model, I imagine, to some of the women around in that post-war era, when we begin to see women really coming into the university system in different parts of France. And one of those was this lady born in Paris, sorry, spelling mistake, Christiane Mendres, who was a young woman who trained in vertebrate paleontology, one of the first to really take up the field. Later, she married the Canadian vertebrate paleontologist Robert Carroll, who died recently, sadly, of COVID. Christiane became a world expert in Permian and Triassic reptiles. So she was one of the first to really get into the whole field of, if you like, dinosaurs and big reptiles. Many women scientists, paleontologists, seem to go into the smaller animals and do micro studies, like myself. I work on microvertebrates, fish scales. But Christiane was really very important and did very important studies on dicynodont fossils from Africa, and was planning many papers, when sadly, after attending the Mesozoic terrestrial ecosystems meeting in Paris, she sadly died in a very tragic fire accident with her son. So a great loss to the profession and to life. Here is a picture that I found, I think, in the SVP news bulletin of the people assembled. Philippe, are you there? Yes. with several other women, some of whom I will mention, also several English colleagues of mine. When I started in 1964, so I know several of the people here. One of the people I want to mention is my next subject, and she's probably the only rather black face in the audience. A very, very rare black person coming into the field of vertebrate paleontology. And she is my next woman. This is Dr. Lawrence Belton, who again, many of you may know her. I'm afraid I do not know if she's still with us. She doesn't seem to have written any papers in recent years, but I met her on several occasions at meetings. She was born, we were trying to find out, is it Réunion or Martinique, but one of the French islands. Martinique, correct, good. And probably studied with Lehmann, and then went into the museum and specialized in the later Paleozoic and Mesozoic fish around the world, some of which had been collected in different expeditions. I'm not sure if she went on expeditions to Madagascar, but she certainly wrote about them. And she wrote some very important papers linking the different fossil fish faunas across Gondwana. And that was really her speciality. The last time I met her was in 1995, when we had an IGCP meeting and an early vertebrate meeting in Paris. And at that time also, other colleagues at the museum that I have worked with and known, Cécile Poplin is a wonderful woman who did so much good work at the museum and joined us in the UNESCO IGCP projects. We went to China, we went to Russia, we went all over the place collecting fossils, and she specializes particularly in the bony fishes and in some of the Permian sharks from France. And these are some of the things she has worked on, the sharks with Daniel Heller, and paleognatid fish from the Oton Basin. And just this year, the end of 2021, and this year, the next in the series that is called Handbook of Palaeoichthyology has just been published on the bony fishes. And this was, in fact, Cécile's work. She had been working on this for a very long time, but as many of you may know, she is no longer able to work, and other colleagues have stepped in and finished the volume, but it actually encompasses Cécile's work. There are many others I could mention at the museum. I won't go into all the living and currently working people. I put a picture there of J.P. Lehmann, who I met first in 1976 in Estonia, where we had a very important meeting. and he had brought 3 younger French colleagues. I called them my 3 musketeers. Yes. He, I think, must have influenced a great deal. And then, of course, Philippe himself, who became director in the lab, also influenced the next generation of younger workers. I am trying to collect the histories and chronologies of all these women, but what I would really like is to see some younger French women who might come in and join me or take over, because I'm getting a bit old now, and carry on the baton to find out more about the French women who have done so much for vertebrate paleontology. Here are some of the pictures of others I don't have time to talk about. Madame Termier, Cécile Mouret-Chauvrier, who works on birds, Sylvie Vents, another fossil fish worker, and Brigitte Senut, who has worked in Africa. Many important women have to be documented. So what can we say? Really, there seems to be a rather dearth in the 19th century, but we start getting more important influx in the middle of the 20th century, with a major surge later in the 20th century, just as in other parts of the, shall we say, the civilized world, the Western world. Post-1970s, particularly, you find material because they've joined the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. And so reports come through and you can learn about their work. And in this century, the 21st, we have much more understanding of how to bring women into science. And that was one of our main aims with our book, was to foster understanding of science, and particularly vertebrate paleontology, to younger women and to girls. But where are the amateurs? I'm not very well, I don't know very much about the amateur field in France. I know there are many good amateur journals, and I would like to investigate a little bit more and find out about them. So, will somebody join me, please, to look at all these clever, wonderful girls? Thank you.
We do have about 2 minutes if anyone has a question. All the way to the top, Hedvig.
I'm Ezio Vaccari, University of Insubria Varese, Italy. Thank you, Sue, very much for this very interesting, this lovely presentation of this hard work, hard task that you have realized on your book. I just was very much interested in when you were talking about sources and the variety of sources that you went through with your colleague editing this book. I realized that there are a big variety of sources. I wonder if there was a category of sources which at the end emerged as the most prevalent, the most, let's say, not important, but maybe most numerous for your historical work. And if maybe it emerged also some unexpected source that helped you in particular for this research. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I suppose, like most of us here, we look to the standard encyclopedias and compilations and biographies. They were useful, and they would bring out some of the most important people like Tilly Edinger. But in general, they were rather lacking in women. I think for us writing the book, the most important were the news bulletins of the SVP. So that only starts in 1940. Before that, you have to look at journals and look for papers. And if you're lucky, of course, the names are written in full. It's a big problem because as fashion goes in science, sometimes women don't put their first names in, and you don't know if it's a man or a woman. If they're Asian, it's very hard for us Westerners to know, is this a man or a woman? So I know in the book, we probably missed some because we're not actually sure. Then we rely, I suppose, on just the internet, of course, these days is a very important source, and word of mouth. We actually interviewed quite a few of the women at different vertebrate paleontology meetings, and from them learned of older women who had worked. For myself, I had worked in the former Soviet Union, I've worked in China, so I could bring those into the book. But we couldn't find many in Africa, for instance, only a few, other than there were French women who'd gone to work in Africa, as with Philippe's expeditions. So you really have to look in every possible page you can, newspaper articles and so on.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, thank you so much, Suzanne. It's very emotional for me. Just a remark, Nicole Petitmer was married to Emil Heinz, so she became Nicole Heinz. And yesterday, you were speaking on the man of La Denise. It was the same person. And
it's another problem because women get married.
Yeah, yes.
And sometimes, of course, they change their name.
Yes. So I will discuss with you after because I have so many information for you.
Thank you.
All this.
We will write the encyclopedia together.
Yeah. Also, these ladies were friends and colleagues, of course. And I study in the university with Cécile Poplin and France de Bois. Sylvie Venn studied the fishes, a colleague, France de Bois, the turtles, and so on. So a funny thing that you speak on Denise Sigogneau. She was married to the American paleontologist Donald Russell. And because his surname was Denise, in the lab, we were laughing, saying that Mr. Russell was the man of La Denise.